The silver forks ceased their scraping against fine porcelain, a sudden, suffocating silence descending upon the room as the dowager's voice sliced through the warmth of the hearth fire, decreeing that a bastard cousin had no place among the well-born, and ordering her to take her meat in the scullery with the stable hands. 12 faces turned, 12 pairs of eyes found her. She stood at the foot of the long mahogany table in a gown the colour of ash, grey merino wool, mended at the collar and at both cuffs, mended so many times that the thread told a history of small, patient repairs. In her hand she held a pewter plate. On the plate, cold boiled beef, a single hard potato. The candlelight caught the pewter and made it look almost beautiful from a distance. Almost. Her knuckles were white, the specific white of a person holding a thing with all their strength because their hands have nowhere else to go. Her chin was lifted, her back was straight. Her expression was the expression of a woman who has practiced stillness the way other women practice needlepoint, in private, in pain, until it becomes second nature. She did not look at the guests. She looked at one person only, the man at the head of the table. Arthur Vance, 9th Duke of Haverbrook, sat very still in his high-backed chair, his dark eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that the guests mistook for indifference. He did not speak. He did not rise, he did not lift a hand, and so the dowager pointed her diamond-encrusted finger toward the service door, and her voice rang out again, commanding, certain, the voice of a woman who had never been disobeyed by anyone she considered beneath her, which was everyone. Clara Sterling took one slow breath, then she took a step toward the service door. Now, let us go back 3 months to where this story truly begins. Yorkshire in 1816 did not look like England was supposed to look. It looked like England was being punished. There had been a volcanic eruption the previous year, somewhere distant and catastrophic, and the ash had spread across the whole northern sky like a shroud. The summer never came. The crops were failing. The light was a permanent pale grey, thin and cold and reluctant, and the hills around Haverbrook Hall wore it like mourning clothes they could not take off. The hall itself stood on a rise above the village, massive and damp and centuries deep, with the particular quality of buildings that have seen too many generations of misery to be surprised by any of the stone walls were 3 feet thick, the fireplaces enormous and still not enough. The cold came through the walls themselves. Clara Sterling had lived at Haverbrook for 4 years, and she knew exactly which rooms were coldest. She had come at 18, after her father died, under the protection of the late Duke, a gentle, ineffectual man who had genuinely meant well and had not understood perhaps that words on a page require a living advocate to give them force. He died 14 months after her arrival. The new Duke arrived 6 months after that. In the interval, the dowager moved. Within a week of her son's return, Clara's monthly allowance was cut to nothing. Within a fortnight, her rooms on the 2nd floor were reassigned to a visiting relation of Lady Beatrice Colmore. The wealthy Earl's daughter, the dowager, had already selected as her son's wife. Clara was moved to the north attic, no hearth, one north-facing window, a trundle bed, a chair, a chest that had belonged to a housemaid who died of consumption, which nobody had mentioned. She was given no candles. This was not an oversight. Clara had her father's books, a small trunk of them from Cornwall, the most valuable things she owned, not in money but in the way a thing is valuable when it is the last connection to a person you have lost. She could not read them in the dark, so she began saving the wax stubs. Every morning the maids swept the chandelier stubs from the drawing-room into the ash pail. Clara retrieved them first. She melted them down in the thimble she kept in her apron pocket, pressing the wicks together with careful fingers, and each night she had approximately 1 hour of guttering, unsteady light, 1 hour of her father's handwriting in the margins, 1 hour in which she was not entirely what they were making of her. This was Clara Sterling. This was how she survived. She was 22 years old, and she was built from the inside out, from the habit of endurance. She had learned to move through this house like water, finding the paths of least resistance, yielding where yielding cost nothing, holding firm where it cost everything. She had learned which servants could be trusted, and which ones reported to the dowager's maid. She had learned that the kindest protection available to her was to be exceptional at the tasks they gave her and invisible in everything else. She mended the household linens with the precision of a woman who understood that the quality of her work was the only language in which she was permitted to speak plainly. She also kept a small notebook in the chest beside her father's books, in which she recorded in the tiniest handwriting she could manage every transaction she observed at Haverbrook, every conversation that happened near enough to overhear, every visitor, every delivery from London, every time the dowager sent for the solicitor. She did not know what she was looking for. She only knew that people in her position, with no institutional power and no advocate, survived by understanding their environment better than their environment understood them. The man who controlled her fate was built from something else entirely. Arthur Vance was 28 and constructed from certainty, tall, sharply dressed, moving through the world with the unhurried authority of a man who has never had to ask for anything, because everything has always simply been provided. His reputation was for cold efficiency. His tenants respected him without liking him, which he seemed to prefer. His peers in the Lords found him difficult to read and avoided direct confrontation, which he also seemed to prefer. He had his mother's cheekbones and his father's height, and neither of their weaknesses, or so the county believed. He arrived at Haverbrook in November, on an evening of driving sleet, and Clara had watched from the attic window as his carriage rolled up the long drive. She had not gone down to receive him. She had not been asked. She met him 10 days later in the library. She had gone at midnight to return a borrowed volume of botanical illustrations, not expecting anyone to be there. He was at the enormous leather-topped desk, illuminated by a single green lamp, surrounded by ledger books stacked to a height that seemed structurally improbable. He was writing with focused mechanical speed, and did not look up when she entered. She stood very still. He said, without lifting his head, that she walked with her weight on the outside of her left foot, and he had identified her by the sound 3 corridors away. He asked, in the tone of a man discussing whether, why she was burning his coal at this hour. She said she had come to return a book. He looked up then, not the way most men looked at her, which was the particular look of measuring what she was worth and concluding not much, but with a precision that was entirely impersonal. Like a surveyor assessing land he has not yet decided whether to purchase. He looked at her for a moment that stretched. Then he told her that her presence in his house was a legal obligation he intended to honor with the barest minimum of expense, and that she should be aware there was no sentiment in the arrangement. He said this not cruelly, but flatly, as though reading from a document he had already reviewed and signed. She set the botanical volume on the nearest shelf. She thanked him very quietly in perfect drawing-room accents, and she left. She did not sleep that night, not because he had frightened her, though he had a little, but because of the sandalwood and rain that clung to him from across the room, and the gold signet ring catching the lamplight every time he moved his pen, and the particular way her body noticed these things before her mind had any say in the matter. It sat in her chest like an ember she had not lit and could not place. She spent the rest of the night very carefully putting it out. The man held every legal and financial power over her existence. He could with a single stroke of that ringed hand free her or destroy her. She had no space, none at all, for the inconvenient fact that his stern face was striking in the lamplight, and that she had stood in the cold library long enough to notice. 2 weeks after Arthur's arrival, Clara was summoned to the morning room. The dowager sat behind the tea-table in purple silk. Lady Beatrice sat beside her in expensive blue that did not quite suit her, her posture the posture of someone who has been told their whole life that posture matters without understanding why. Arthur stood at the window with his back to the room. Clara read the scene the way she had trained herself to read rooms, cataloguing exits, expressions, the temperature of the air, and understood immediately that this was a scene designed to be witnessed. The dowager commanded her to the low footstool below everyone else to mend a torn hem in Lady Beatrice's gown. Clara complied. She folded herself to the carpetet and began to work, her fingers quick and certain, while the dowager spoke about Beatrice's dowry in tones designed to carry, and Beatrice did not look down at her. Arthur had returned to his armchair. He was reading a newspaper. He did not look up. Then Lady Beatrice made a remark about Clara's father, about his limp, about the family's embarrassment at having to acknowledge him. It was delivered in a light conversational tone, the tone of someone who does not realize, or does not care, that they are being cruel. Clara's hand slipped. The pin entered the soft pad of Beatrice's finger. Beatrice made a sharp sound, and the dowager rose, and her hand came up with the deliberateness of a blow designed to leave no mark. Arthur dropped his newspaper, not set it down, dropped it. He was across the room in 4 steps, his hand closing around Clara's wrist. Not roughly, but with a certainty that was its own kind of force, and he told his mother and Beatrice to leave. They left. The door had barely closed before he released her. Clara stood from her knees, aware of the warmth of his grip, furious at herself for being aware of it. He told her. His voice returned to flat and distant. That clumsiness was a liability in this house, and she would do well to master her hands. She thanked him in perfect, unhurried accents and walked out. In the corridor she stood with her back against the wall and breathed very carefully the way she had taught herself to breathe when the thing happening was too complicated to respond to with the equipment she had available. 2 months passed. The cold intensified. The crops continued to fail. The dowager's campaign against Clara grew steadily more inventive, and Clara held her line, courteous to the servants, immaculate in manners toward the family, making the cruelty look entirely unprovoked which the dowager knew and which made her worse. Then Arthur found the codicil. Working through estate papers at midnight, he found it folded between pages of an accounts book from 12 years prior. His father's handwriting, stating plainly that Thomas Sterling had died leaving £10,000 to be held in trust by the Duke of Haverbrook until his daughter reached 25 or married. He went further back through the ledgers. He found where the money had gone, distributed across a dozen accounts, dissolved into the general ruin of his father's gambling disaster. Every penny gone. There was a morning that Clara passed him in the library corridor, and he looked at her with such controlled blankness that it stopped her mid-step. Not cruelty, something behind glass. A man who could not afford to feel what he was feeling. She did not understand it then. The dowager learned of the codicil by means Clara never fully discovered. The effect was immediate. She sent for Mr. Grimes. The land steward of the outer parcels was 57, wide, loud, red-faced, and useful to the family in ways that did not bear examination. On Wednesday morning, Clara was presented with a marriage contract. She read it from top to bottom. She folded it precisely in half, then in half again. She set it on the dowager's escritoire, aligned with the corner of the blotter, and said in a voice of velvety calm that she required time to consider. She walked back to the north attic and sat on the trundle bed in the grey light with her hands in her lap. She could leave. She could accept Grimes and have a roof and no more pewter plates. She would be exchanging one degradation for a worse one with no end. Or she could stay. Something was wrong in this house. The pressure being applied to her had an urgency beneath it she could feel but not yet read. She thought for the first time clearly that the pressure was not because she was worthless. It might be because she was dangerous. She stayed. She found the desk 3 days later. She had been assigned to catalogue the stored items in the north attic, which served the dual purpose of keeping her out of sight and providing unpaid labour, and she was working by the last thin afternoon light when she found it under a horse blanket inside a velvet trunk. Her father's writing desk. Walnut. Brass fittings. She recognized it immediately. She found the raised edge in the lining of the inner compartment. She worked it open with her thumbnail. Inside, folded into a precise square, was a baptismal certificate. Dual entry. 2 sons born the same day at the same hour, 10 minutes apart. The elder, Thomas, born with a deformity of the left foot. The second, Edward. Thomas had been her father. He was born 10 minutes before the man who became the 8th Duke of Haverbrook. He was the eldest son, the true heir. And someone had decided that an heir born imperfect was an embarrassment the lineage could not survive. Thomas had been moved to second, a record had been altered, and Clara's father had spent his entire life in Cornwall, with a small cottage and a library and a daughter, never asking what he had been given away. Clara did not cry. She sat on the attic floor for a long time, holding the certificate, while the grey light faded. Every apology she had ever made, every careful curtsy, every hour spent making herself small enough to be tolerated in this house. All of it built on the premise that she was a charity case, a burden, a dependent who should be grateful for a cold potato. None of it had ever been true. She folded the certificate and tucked it inside her stays, close to her heart. Then she rose and began to think. Stay with me now, because you can see the shape of it from here, how perfectly she has been cornered, and how perfectly they have underestimated her. It is about to get worse before it gets extraordinary. The grand banquet was the dowager's masterwork. She planned it over 3 weeks, invited 12 members of the gentry, ordered the kitchens to produce a feast of considerable ambition. The day before the dinner, she informed Clara, in the morning room with Lady Beatrice present, that she would not be seated at the table. Dependents who did not earn their keep would not sit above the salt. A plate would be sent to the kitchen. This was, the dowager noted, more than was strictly required. That afternoon, while the kitchens churned and the household moved in careful preparation, Clara went to the library. She was not there to read. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the desk, at the arrangement of the ledgers, at the shape of work done here night after night. On the corner, half hidden under a folder, was a document with a London banking house's letterhead bearing Arthur's name. A debtor's notice, the sum in excess of £40,000. She left the library and went upstairs and put on her grey gown. By 7 the guests were seated, the candles already running pale tracks down the silver holders, the crystal catching the light and throwing it in small, bright pieces across the white tablecloth. Clara came downstairs at 7:30 carrying the pewter plate the dowager's maid had brought to the attic an hour before. Cold boiled beef, a hard potato, the deliberate insult of adequate but joyless food. She walked into the dining room through the servants' entrance as the dowager rose and pointed toward the service door, and the room went still again, and Arthur looked at her from the head of the table and said, without a flicker, that she should do as his mother commanded. That pride did not fill an empty belly. She looked at him for one moment, then she turned toward the service door. Mr. Grimes was waiting in the corridor with his oily smile, and he whispered to her that a week in his cottage would take the high and mighty spine right out of her. She walked past him, down the corridor, past the kitchen, toward the back of the hall. She stopped at the library door. She stood in the corridor with her pewter plate for a long still minute. Then she went in. A new document lay on the desk, a deed of trust dated 2 weeks prior, establishing a fund of £10,000 in the name of Miss Clara Sterling, derived from the personal of assets belonging to Arthur Vance. A London property, a racing interest, separate holdings, silver plate, a library in Kent, 11 items, every personal asset he possessed, stripped to nothing, total exactly £10,000. He had given her the money himself. He had taken every personal thing he owned and turned it into her stolen dowry. He had been cold to her, had let her be humiliated, had sat reading his newspaper while she knelt on the floor, so that his mother would not suspect his loyalty lay anywhere but with the family. Because if the dowager had suspected, Clara would have been driven from the house before any document could be filed. He had taken the hatred of every person in this house onto himself to act as her shield. Clara set the pewter plate on his desk. She stood with both hands flat on the wood and breathed slowly. Outside, the faint clink of crystal from the dining room, the murmur of well-fed voices. She could walk out the back door, take the deed and the certificate, and make her way to London on the morning coach and never see Yorkshire again. She had the legal grounds, she had the money, she had everything she had come here to find. She thought about Arthur at midnight over a ledger, stripping himself of every personal possession item by item to restore what his father had stolen. She picked up the pewter plate. She walked back down the corridor, past the kitchen, past Grimes in his chair, and she put her hand on the main doors of the dining hall. The doors opened. I want you to listen very carefully now, because what happens next is the kind of thing the well-born families of Yorkshire whispered about for the rest of their lives. Clara walked in through the main doors, not the service entrance, the main doors, the doors that guests used. The room went silent, but differently this time. Not the silence of a judgment being delivered, but the silence of something unexpected at entering a space that thought it had already decided the evening's shape. She walked the length of the room. She did not look at the guests, not at the dowager who had risen again to her feet, not at Lady Beatrice. She kept her eyes on Arthur, who had also risen, very slowly, his face the colour of old paper. She stopped at the centre of the table. Her voice, when she spoke, did not need to be raised. The room was so quiet it carried to every corner. She said that he had told her pride did not fill an empty belly. She let the words sit for a breath. Then she said that a stolen bread tastes of ash, no matter if it is served on silver or pewter. She looked at the dowager when she said this, and the dowager looked back with the expression of a woman beginning to understand. For the first time, that she may have made an error, Clara said. She had been ordered to eat with the servants because his mother believed her blood was lesser. And then her voice dropped, low, dangerous, precise, and she said they both knew whose pockets were filled with whose gold tonight. She looked at Arthur when she said the last thing, only at Arthur. She said she would take her leave of this house. She would not take her leave of her name. Then she set the pewter plate on the white tablecloth, directly in front of the Dowager Duchess, precisely aligned, with a deliberateness that was more devastating than any theatrical gesture could have been. She turned and walked toward the door. Behind her she heard the crash. She did not stop walking, but she felt it, the specific violence of a heavy chair being knocked over by someone who had exceeded the reach of careful. She heard the dowager's voice, shrill and commanding, calling his name. She heard footsteps, fast, purposeful, following her out. Arthur came through the door after her. She was standing at the top of the grand stone staircase, in the rain. It had been raining all evening, a relentless cold Yorkshire downpour that had turned the gravel drive into rivers, and she was already drenched, her grey gown dark and heavy, her hair coming loose. She had not brought a cloak. She turned to face him. He was drenched too. He had come out without stopping for a coat, and the rain had gone through his evening jacket immediately, and he was breathing as though he had been running, though the distance from the dining room to the staircase was barely 30 feet. In his hand he was carrying her pewter plate. He said her name. Just that, Clara. And then he stopped, because that was apparently the full extent of what he had prepared, and he was standing in the rain on his own front steps, holding a plate of cold food and nothing else at all, which was perhaps a more honest version of himself than anyone at Haverbrook had seen in a very long time. Then he went down on his knees, not gracefully, not with the calculated submission of a man performing humility. He went down onto the wet stone with an abruptness that was entirely graceless and entirely genuine, and he looked up at her from the steps. He said he had nothing left to offer her. The money was hers, properly documented, legally irrefutable, hers by right and by his own hand. He said his mother would use the debts to force the marriage to Beatrice, and he would let her because he had nothing else remaining, and he was not asking Clara to care about that. He understood she owed him nothing. He had been cold to her. He had let things happen. He had no defence she had not already seen through. He said he was aware, standing here, that he was a duke on his knees in the rain, holding a plate of cold-boiled beef, and that this was perhaps a fair picture of where his choices had brought him. Behind them, through the high windows, the guests had pressed toward the glass. The coachmen had gathered at the edge of the drive. Everyone was watching. The myth of Haverbrook was dismantling itself in the rain, piece by piece, in full public sight. Arthur looked at the plate in his hand. He took a piece of the cold beef between his fingers, the food his mother had sent as a weapon, the food he had told Clara to accept in front of 12 witnesses, the food meant to mark her as something lesser, and he ate it, slowly, without ceremony, chewed and swallowed. Then he held the plate out to her, in his other hand the signed deed of trust. She looked at him for a long time. He had surrendered not just the money. Money was paper and figures, and entirely manageable. He had surrendered the other thing, the certainty, the control, the glass wall he had built around himself for 28 years, because he had watched love weaponized and decided that needing nothing was the only safety. He needed something now, and he had offered her no theatre about it. He had showed her the truth of it in the rain on his own knees. Clara looked down at him on the wet stone, the rain washing down both their faces, the light from the hall windows falling across them, and she thought about a man who had no idea how to show anyone that he cared for them, who had decided that the most honest declaration available was to make himself entirely nothing on her behalf. She held out her hand. He took it. She did not say in that moment what she understood about him. It would have been too large and too soon for the rain-soaked steps of a dismantled household. But she understood it. She understood that he had spent his entire adult life watching affection used as a weapon, watching his mother make his father weak with sentiment, watching need exploited until it became ruin, and had decided, somewhere in his late youth, that the only safe arrangement was to need nothing and feel nothing and keep everything behind glass. She had seen the glass. She had looked at it a dozen times in a dozen corridors and wondered what was behind it. Now she knew. Behind the glass was a man who had sat at a desk at midnight for a year, stripping himself methodically of every personal possession he owned, item by quiet item, so that a woman he had been cold to, in the library, could have what was already hers. Arthur did not speak. Standing on the steps, he waited. He was, she thought, extraordinarily good at waiting, for a man who had spent his life controlling things. She looked at him for one more long moment. The rain ran down both their faces. The light from the hall windows lay across them in long, pale oblongs, and somewhere behind the glass the shapes of guests were still pressed close and watching, and she thought, "Let them watch," she said, very quietly, that he might want to get up off the wet stone before he ruined the only pair of evening trousers he had left. His mouth moved briefly in a way that was not quite a smile, but was the nearest she had ever seen him come to one. He stood. For the first time in 30 years, the grand doors of Haverbrook Hall had slammed shut from the outside, leaving the elite of Yorkshire to stare at an empty table, while a duke followed an outcast into the storm. They did not go back into the dining room that night. The guests went home. The dowager retired to her rooms and did so for the first time in Clara's memory, without issuing a command to anyone. Mr. Grimes was gone by morning. It emerged in the following weeks that his management of the outer parcels had involved financial arrangements that did not survive scrutiny, and his dismissal required only the documentation of what he had already done. An honest tenant farmer who had worked the northern fields for 30 years was appointed in his place. The legal proceedings took several months, as they always do. The baptismal certificate, properly authenticated, established what it established. The deed of trust, properly filed, restored what it restored. Clara did not flee to Cornwall. She never had any real intention of fleeing. Cornwall had always been an exit, and she had spent 4 years at Haverbrook understanding that exits are not the same as victories. She used £10,000 to purchase the debt-ridden, unentailed lands of Haverbrook from the creditors who held them. She purchased them in her own name and became the legal landlord of the families who had worked that land for generations. not a room she could be moved out of, not a cottage someone could lock, a home large enough to ensure that no one within it went cold. Arthur remained Duke. He managed the estate, with skill and genuine attention, now that he was no longer doing it under the weight of a secret, and he managed it for her, in the sense that she set the terms and he honoured them. They married in the spring, in the small parish church in the village, with no county guests. The tenant families attended. The dowager was given a dower house in Scotland, small, damp, a very long way from Yorkshire. Her allowance was managed with impeccable courtesy and total inflexibility by Clara, and the grand dining room at Haverbrook Hall was eventually restored to warmth. The candles were good candles now. The table was long and set for many, and the fire in the hearth was large enough to feel from the doorway. At the head of the table Clara sat. In front of her, set alongside the silver and the crystal, was a pewter plate. She had placed it there herself the first night she took that chair, and it remained thereafter, not as a wound kept open, as a record, a reminder that the whole story of her life had hinged once on where they had made her stand, and that she had stood there, and that she was still standing. Arthur poured her wine himself. He always poured her wine himself. In the end, the world believes that thrones are made of gold and secured by decree. They do not see that the truest thrones are built in the quiet corners of a bruised soul, maintained by a dignity that no insult can diminish. Clara Sterling ate with the servants, not because she was low, but because her grace could illuminate the darkest cellar, and the man who carried her plate upstairs learned that a crown is only worth wearing when one is willing to lay it at the feet of the righteous. If you felt the justice of that final feast, ensure you are subscribed to whispered thrones before you close your eyes tonight. Sleep deeply, my friends, and remember, let them give you the pewter plate. The silver belongs to you in the morning.